you all for coming to tonight's Shalom Task Force event in coordination with Shenk, Shul, and the Washington Heights community. It's an honor to have all of you here, sorry. I'm now just gonna turn the microphone over to Gabby Miller, and then Shana and I will start a discussion. And just a disclaimer, everyone, feel free, send the questions directly to me, or if you can't, send them to Shenk President. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Tonight we have the privilege to be joined by two experts in their field. The first is Dr. Shana Frydman, PhD, LCSW, Executive Director of Shalom Task Force. Shana is a trauma-informed therapist and advocate and has worked in the field of domestic abuse and family violence with a specialty in the Jewish community for close to 20 years. Shana co-chairs the UJA Task Force on Family Violence, a collaboration of community agencies and leaders that work collaboratively to best provide support and resources to vulnerable populations affected by family violence and serves in several community leadership roles. Shana regularly lectures about healthy relationships, intimate partner abuse, sexual abuse, trauma, and culturally informed practice. She has published on those and related subjects. Dr. Frydman graduated with her MSW from the University of Maryland School of Social Work with honors and earned her PhD at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, Hunter College Silberman School of Social Work. We are also joined by Michelle Siegel, LCSW. Michelle graduated with honors from Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University in 2016. While in school, she interned under the leadership of Shana Frydman at Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty's Family Violence Program, where she engaged in counseling with those struggling with their relationships. Michelle has also worked with children and families, as well as the elderly, which is her current focus. Michelle also serves on the board of the Shenk Shul and is a proud member of the Washington Heights community. So before I hand it off to our accomplished speakers, a couple of logistics. Please note that tonight's webinar is being recorded. And as Michelle said, we encourage all of your comments and questions, and please use the chat box feature to ask your questions and send them directly to Michelle. And without further ado, I'm gonna hand the mic off to Dr. Frydman and Michelle. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Gabby. It's an honor to be here and speaking on behalf of the community. Hi, Bobby. So I wanted to have this discussion, I guess like roundtable discussion with Shana. I worked with her several years ago when I was interning at Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty in the Family Violence Program. And I really learned a lot from her, and I wanted to bring her to the community in the best way possible to kind of share her expertise. And we got amazing feedback from the last seminar we had. And I wanted to continue this conversation with the community. And just because the event is tonight doesn't mean the conversation's over. I'm here to continue the conversation after tonight with all of you. While we are a young community, my hope is that we can identify ways that the community as a whole can be helpful to those struggling in their relationships. So, Shana, we learned a lot from your colleagues about relationships and how this could help us think about this issue and our role of helping. What does it mean to be supportive?
It is so wonderful to be here. I mentioned this before and some of you are just getting on, but I grew up in Washington Heights in many ways. I was there for my young adulthood before it was as popular as it is now. And it really has informed, the positive experience I had then really informed, personally the way I think about community. And I know it's even more robust, but it's helped me think about community and support in many ways. I want to just start by thanking Michelle for inviting me. I know she worked with my colleague Yeshaya arranging this program. I also want to thank the Shenk Shul in collaboration of JCC, the Shea of YU, Mount Sinai, and the base, right? It's amazing to see that you're all able to come together, and that is the first way we create help and we create support, is by coming together. And it's very inspiring to me that we're able to do that. And I do hope to be able to come to you and really meet all of you when we're able to do that safely. But here we are in the Zoom room. As much as this is in conversation with Michelle and I together, I would love to find ways that we could all kind of talk tonight. We had the hour together. So I wanted to start before I talk about what I think support means and how we help, is to hear from you. And let's just take a minute now. You could put in the chat, or if you want to just unmute yourself for a second, if it doesn't get too unruly. When you hear it being of support, when you hear the word living in a supportive community or offering support or help, what word comes to your mind? I'm gonna look at the chat. Oh, I have a PowerPoint, but I have a hard time with chat and PowerPoint at the same time. Let's see.
People who care, right?
Gonna stop sharing. People who care. What other things do you think about when you say we want to be supportive or I need support? What other things do people think about? People who are there for you in times of need. Are there specific actions that you've seen?
A listening ear, provide services, professional, but also community-based listening for the sake of understanding. You know, also it could be a physical, you know, we could just like need that meal, right? There could have been a hard time. Somebody might have had a hard day. They got in a fight with their boss. God forbid that should ever happen. But like they had a really hard day. You're bringing them something as well.
Somebody wrote who are sensitive to diverse struggles, right? You know, not that there's lots of different needs, right? It's not only around one issue. A short text saying, I think of you. I like that, right? Knowing that someone is thinking about you. So a lot of different ideas that we think about when it comes to support. You know, I think back in my life at times where I was supported. I remember there was a family member of mine who was really ill, and thank God is well now. But our family was in crisis for a pretty sustained period of time, probably 12, 14 months. And a friend of mine's mother, who wasn't a close friend of ours, as a family, would bring us fresh challah every week. And I just remember thinking that it was like a token to say to you, you know, you're not forgotten. Right? It was like, you're not forgotten. There was like this just arm that was out to us. And I remember other times in my life where I've given, you know, we talk about meals, and I think it's a very, I don't know, Shul Jewish thing that we do. But I think the underlying message to those kind of actions, you know, the short text, the meals, sending a letter in the beginning of COVID. I was just saying, you know, I was home for many, many months with my young children, and I bought a whole package of like blank cards, and it was an activity for us to write cards to people that we missed. We haven't seen my family in a very long time. They're not local. And the activity, we should walk around the block to find the the mailbox. And we learned about how to address a letter, which you don't know anymore, right? And use stamps. But, you know, what that meant to people on the other side, you know, was really very meaningful to family members, older family members, to get, you know, a picture from a 6-year-old. And what the underlying message was, you know, I care about you, I miss you, I want to be all helpful to you, and you are not alone. And when you look at like academic journals and literature about what it means to be supportive and supportive community, you look at religious communities, they often look at that. And they talk about how religious communities are often, there are mediators there for life stressors, but it's not per se, and I don't know if there's a rabbi here who's listening, it's not per se the religious practice, right? It's not the davening or even the confession. It's really a sense of being part of community. And I think that if we would look back in our past 11 months, and I don't speak for all of you, we've learned what community means, both in the way that we've grown community in unusual and innovative ways, but also in many ways how we miss community, how we miss seeing people as much, and how important that is. So that's kind of like academically what you look like. But I think when we talk about, I'm gonna try to share I like using PowerPoints, it keeps me on track, but sometimes it's distracting. So we'll see how it goes. But when we talk about what like just a lay person's definition of support is to, here we go, is to give assistance, right? The verb would be to give it, there we go. To give assistance, right? Or enable or function or act. But the other way of thinking about it, I actually like this visualization. It helps me, is to be a buttress, to be a brace, something that holds other things up, to help hold some other people up. And to me, that's really illuminating to think about. But then it comes down to how do we do that? Right? How do we do that? And how do we do that in the hardest with the hardest of issues? And even as someone who's worked in the field for way longer than I think I'm willing to admit right now, is, you know, I don't always know what the right answer is that, but we have to think about a framework on how to do that. And I have some ideas. My hope is, I always say to my team at work, you know, when you go to a lecture, you go to a webinar, let's try to walk away with 1 or 2 nuggets. You don't, you know, a lot of times you may know a lot of it, but let's try to walk away with a few of those takeaways that, oh, I'm going to think about this a little bit differently, or maybe I'll incorporate it. And I hope I could offer that to you tonight as we think about how do we lend support and offer support to other people that is a brace, that is in a way they need it. So obviously my perspective comes from working with survivor victims of family violence, domestic violence, with this specialty of the Jewish community. But I think a lot of the ideas around how to lend support are true for diverse situations, like we mentioned before. So those are where I'm thinking about right now is we want to be able to be that person. We're here tonight because we want to be a person who's supportive to one another. What do we do? How do we become that brace? That's how I'd like to begin. Michelle, do you want to?
Okay, so I think that that's a great start to discussing how to support and what is support exactly. Shana, if you could go to the next slide. So what is domestic abuse? Could also be called intimate partner violence, domestic violence, or relationship abuse. Domestic abuse is a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another and instill fear in an intimate relationship. There are different types of abuse that can come about in a relationship. There's physical, verbal, emotional, financial, spiritual, psychological, and sexual abuse as well. And these are all things that can impact a relationship and can put a relationship at risk. So, I mean, there are numerous reasons why these happen, and we don't necessarily know why somebody is going to be emotionally abusive to another person. It could be trauma, it could be whatever reason. But really the warning signs, and that's kind of what we discussed last time in a way, might be able to save a relationship.
So I think when we talk about this, and this is not going to be the focus of this evening, that could always be another discussion about like really the ins and out of what domestic violence is. But you know what Michelle just said is so important, is looking at what a pattern of behaviors that are power and control. And what she described are all these very, very difficult things, from physical to sexual, emotional, digital, spiritual. And it's really, people in these situations are on the continuum. And I know that Yeshaya and Avital talked about this, of, you know, healthy, or I call it healthy enough relationships, whole different discussion, to unhealthy or high conflict, to people who are experiencing interpersonal violence. And we all need support. I mean, one thing that I would like to say is that we all need support in our lives, and we all need support in our relationships. And I think that's a challenge. And it's always something I love to discuss with people, because I think that's always a challenge in, particularly, I would say, you know, I want to say only in the Jewish community. Somebody wants an example of spiritual abuse. I love talking about spiritual abuse. Give me a second. Is because we have a real sense of sanctity of marriage and privacy and tzniut. At the same time, we need support, right? In my doctoral research, I talked about people who are going through issues of sexual intimacy issues, and how many of the people who were in my sample would talk about delaying getting help for like 7-8 years because they didn't know how to talk about it, right? To think about that, and how do we go to people for support? How do we support other people and not take sides? And it's really something to think about. Let me just go back. Moshe asked a question here. How do we talk about example of spiritual abuse? So the whole idea of abuse, let's just take a second back, is patterns of behavior that exert power and control over the other person. And we see that physically. I think that, and if we were to do a whole lecture about that, you visualize it in the middle as the dynamic is about power and control, and all. And for maybe some of you are familiar with the Duluth model, the outer circle, what keeps it together are an overt or covert threat of physical or sexual violence. And then there's all the other tools that the person who abuses will use. And I often revert back to using he and she, but anybody could be the perpetrator, anyone could be the survivor victim.
And I think that's one thing to identify, is that there's no gender roles. And obviously this is not going to be the main focus of tonight, but there's no specific gender roles. Like I've seen men in my capacity who are being abused by women, or women who are being abused by men, in all different realms. It doesn't necessarily like, and the people don't need.
And we also assist people who are in same-sex relationships as well.
Exactly.
So it just needs to be said. It just the often we will often say he, she, just because that's what the statistics will say. But I'll tell you that both parties can be in either situation. But to give an example of spiritual abuse, there are different ways people will abuse. So, you know, if you're talking about emotional verbal abuse, they'll use language, or emotional to keep power and control. Isolation is one of those factors. So then we move into spiritual abuse, something that we witnessed as someone who's worked in the Jewish community or in faith-based communities, is using religion or using the relationship with the person's God, be it whatever that is. In this environment, we're talking about Hashem, as a way of controlling, or using mitzvot as a way of controlling. So it could be something to the effect of asserting and coercion during nida, right? So it's not only is it a sexual assault, we consider that a spiritual assault. It is making it impossible for someone to keep mitzvot, right? So an example that I did a teen program last night, and an example a teen shared with me was, you know, when one party was Shomer Shabbat and the other party was not, and the party that's not Shomer Shabbat closed off all the lights and made it impossible for the other person to have Shabbat, knowing that the Shomer Shabbat partner wouldn't turn it on, right? Or, you know, I think back of a patient I treated for many years, and one of the dynamics in the relationship was gaslighting, making the other person feel like they're crazy. And that's part of the dynamic of domestic violence, in which the person will it's part of like the chipping away at the person's sense of self. So, you know, this woman was coming to see me for treatment, for therapy. She was still in the relationship, and she was describing how one of the major issues in the family was that she would prepare Shabbat. She would get ready, the meal, everything, and she would get ready, and they would come to Friday night, and she like couldn't get herself together, and the food was always cold. It never was good. And then it became a huge fight, and it was a huge issue every single week. And I would just like, at some point I like looked at her, I'm like, why is this happening? Like practically, why is this happening? And it turned out that, you know, she would put everything on the blech, you know, on the heating element to keep the food warm. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the idea of not turning on the oven or electricity on Shabbat. And she would go upstairs to get ready, and he would go off to Shul. And every single week we came to the fact that he would just turn it off. And, you know, so it was this gaslighting, but it was using a form of
spiritual abuse,
halacha, right, to make her feel bad. So there's a lot of things like that we see that are very particular, that are related, using Jewish text. So, I mean, I don't want to completely focus on this, but I'm hoping that answers that question. But we could, you know, just think about many ways people could be abusive in the sense of power, of asserting power and control without having to be physically or sexually abusive.
Correct.
And yeah, go ahead.
Interject as well. Like, it could just be like, I just don't want you to go to this place, but like not really telling somebody why you don't want them to go. And like, that could be taken as abuse as well. I know that one thing that came up in my practice when I was an intern, I had a woman who the husband like kept hiding her shaitels. And like, she wouldn't go out with a tichon. She would only go out with a shaitel. So like, it's also a form, like, it doesn't necessarily need to be concrete physical or sexual abuse. Right. There's emotional, there's verbal, there's psychological, there's all types of abuse. And I think that I always think about the many reasons why it's so hard for the survivors of domestic violence to reach out, although it's not the focus today. Maybe we can kind of lead into that discussion a little bit, to touch on it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to think about like why people don't reach out, and not only don't reach out about family violence, even though obviously that's my kind of thought process, but like, why don't people reach out for help in general? So, you know, after, you know, typically when we do a lengthy discussion on what is domestic violence, questions like, why doesn't she leave? I don't love how that's phrased, because it puts a lot of the onus on the survivor victim, and or she or he leave. But like, what are the barriers? And that's where I think it's important to think about this, because it does help us think about where would help come in. So we think about them in different factors, the practical factors. You know, how does it actually work? You know, the money, the increased danger after leaving, what we do with children, are there shelter options, the emotional factors, something we're going to go back to, the relationship factors, you know, that it isn't always violent, that there's hope, there's promise to change, there's denial around it, and then there's social factors. So let's think about for a moment, like some of the emotional and social factors when someone's coming forward, right? And I really, for this discussion, it shouldn't really say obstacles to leave it, much more like, what are the barriers to coming, what are the barriers for sharing what you're going through with a friend? What are the barriers to accessing help? It doesn't mean leaving, accessing support. Like, what gets in the way from people? So I would even, you know, take a stop right now. I'm actually gonna stop the share for a second so I can see people. You know, like, what are barriers in our lives? And it doesn't have to be family violence, but if you were thinking about what are
worry that you won't be believed,
right? Like barriers in any of our lives, and we're going through some struggle of why is it that we don't reach out for help, right? Like what is it? You know, I can imagine in my life, there's things that, you know, there's a sense of shame, right? Like an embarrassment or very lonely. Like, am I the only one going through that?
or negative stigma.
I want to say, I think discussions like this are so important because, like, if we saying it out loud here, then it means it's important, right? At least we're saying it so that if someone, even if they're not here tonight, but they see the ad for it, they see a flyer, they see a social media post, somebody after this writes something up, then they know, oh, I'm not the only one going through this. It makes it easier for them to come forward. So somebody wrote, worry that person you're telling will belittle you, right? That the person won't believe you, or they'll kind of put you down about it. Like, it's not a big deal. What are other things people think about?
Well, Shana, we actually had a question.
I don't see the question. Yes.
No, it was sent to me.
Okay.
Is this understanding still applied to someone who does not intend to maintain power and control and are rather instigating it based on their own beliefs and insecurities and mental health issues, but the end result creates a power struggle and a desire to fulfill wishes in order to avoid being yelled at? That's a very deep question.
Whoa, that's a lot. So, I mean, I don't know if I understand all the question in there, but certainly when you're looking at the continuum of healthy, unhealthy, high conflict, and abuse, there are times when someone could be acting abusively, like the behavior might look abusive, but the dynamic is not about power and control. Now, that doesn't mean, right, I want to put this, it doesn't mean the behavior is acceptable. It doesn't mean the behavior is safe. It doesn't mean the other person doesn't have the right to do whatever they look at any options they want, but it may be a different dynamic. And I don't know that I actually went to a 6-hour, like a really long lecture creating around this a few weeks ago. There are some good books about this, but so there are sometimes people act in this way and it's not coming from a place of being about power and control. It may be from a place of mental health issues. It may be from a place of insecurity. It may be a place from their own trauma. That doesn't mean that that behavior is acceptable and they have to be responsible for it. It may be that the intervention looks a little different if the person who's being hurt, I don't want to know if I want to use the word victim or survivor, person being hurt chooses a different type of intervention. And that's where it's really important to, and this is, you'll see it later on my nuggets is, I don't know if there's a rabbi here, but rabbis always tell me their most important tool is the Rolodex, like to know who to call to talk about it, because you would want that person to sit down with someone who has an understanding of both abuse, but have understanding of couple dynamics and try to help flush out like what is an appropriate intervention? Is there somewhere to work together? Because in general, if it's a dynamic of power and control and it's abuse, it is counterindicated to be in couples counseling. Like, we do not recommend it. We consider it dangerous. So it's a very different intervention. So I can't go into like a long thing right now about that, but I think it's really important. And if that's something that pertains to someone here who wants to learn more about it, I am fairly accessible. I'm an email away from people. You're welcome to call our hotline. You'll have the number later. We have a chat line now that's staffed by my incredible social work staff. And they'll certainly be there to help. And our hotline and our chat line are absolutely confidential. So if it's somewhere to get more information, that's that Rolodex I'm talking about, how important it is to do that. So another thing that came in about like what gets in the way from coming forward about any of our issues, and then we'll talk about domestic violence, and they're the same, is somebody wrote, people just don't know how to listen. That's true. It's very hard for people to be present. People, maybe they'll be they're in denial. And I think that's also something very important, that it might be happening, but part of our coping mechanisms through hard things is to deny it. So they might not even see it themselves. And they'll blame you for the issue. And that's something that we absolutely see, right? Certainly our community has shifted in this, but you know, advice to someone who's describing family violence is not to say cook a better meal or what have you done wrong, right? That's not appropriate. You know, it's not about shalom bias or shalom bayit. It's not about, you know, just, it is a different dynamic. Yeah, one of my staff members very smartly just wrote, if anyone needs some help, we are open tonight till 10 o'clock on the chat line. So make sure that it is available to you and it start again tomorrow. So we are available. Okay, so here are some of the ideas about why people have a hard time coming forward. And so people, you know, that there's a shame, there's the sense of isolation, a sense of what should community look like. And these are very important things to think about as we try to think about how can we best respond? What would it mean for us to best respond? And so what I often find happens, and I wonder if this relates to people here, is that you want to respond. Like you want to be that person who knows how to respond. I'm getting back up here with you guys. But you're afraid that you don't know what to do, and you're afraid to get into a role of being a rescuer. Right. And one of the questions I know, Michelle, you got beforehand, and you could interject, was something to the effect of, I want to be helpful, but then I'm afraid to like take it all on. Right. And I'll never be, I won't know what to do. I won't know how to.
Like, what if I say the wrong thing? Or what if I overstep my boundaries? Like, there's always like that line of like, how far should you go? Right. How far should you go into someone else's world, and how far are they willing to let you go?
Right. And so I think we want to work with that. Let's start with that idea, and then let's get into what some of the things you could do. We make a real distinction in our work about the difference between a rescuer and a helper. And this is our, you know, I'm talking to you as being not as professionals, and I'm talking to myself, not as a professional, but as a community member. What does it mean to be a rescuer versus a helper? So I think a rescuer is when we give help when it's not even being asked of us. We don't ask what their needs are, but we just assume. And I'm not talking about dropping off challah. I'm saying, you know, making arrangements for their families. Or I share this story. It was probably the best example. This goes back close to 20 years ago. In my first position, I was doing some outpatient work, actually at O Health Clinic. I worked at their family violence shelter for a few years. And I was working with these two young women who were very, very concerned about their friend. And it was a beautiful thing to watch. They were absolutely certain their friend was being terribly abused. And they wanted to save her. And that was the language they would use. They wanted to save her and they didn't know what to do. And I'd spend time with them talking about and coaching them about how to be a helper, how to use supportive statements, how to help with empowerment, how to be present. Somebody said, you won't be believed, how to believe her if she does disclose, how to create good boundaries. And we worked on this, and they were absolutely utterly distraught about their friend. I mean, we should all be blessed with friends like that, quite honestly. And we're talking about what is practically possible for her. And one day I was sitting at my desk doing some, case notes, and I got a call from one of them saying, Shana, you can't believe what happened. They were sick of it. They were fed up watching her be hurt so much. They went to her place of employment, and they basically abducted her. Like, they took her from the office in their car, and they were going to take her away from her husband. There were no children in the family. She jumped out of a moving car, and she just wasn't ready. And they said, Shana, you were right. Like, we can't do what she's not ready for. Lo and behold, a few years later, I've been in this field in different agencies, so people find me. It's actually one of the privileges of being in this field this long, is that I hear from people at different stages of strength, and that's always gratifying to me. So a few years later, the woman who was being saved, the survivor, actually called me, and she goes, I know that you were in touch with my friends. I'm out of the relationship, and she was doing extraordinarily well. But it was such a visual of what happens when we try to, in some way, disempower. So one of the things we talk about is, especially with this population, is because the dynamic is so much about power and control, we need to help empower the person, right? We don't want to tell them what to do, because then we're just replicating that dynamic. So a rescuer gives more longer than is needed. They personalize the outcome. And let me tell you, I still do that at times, right? Like, if I'm doing all this work and I'm trying so hard, why isn't it working, right? Why? why is it so hard? Why isn't it just, feels bad and feels responsible? And then when we're talking about being a helper, you're offering support as it's wanted or needed. You're checking in, but you're having boundaries, right? You're giving that person boundaries, and so much around around intimate partner violence and like personal abuse and violence and sexual assault is about a lack of boundaries and a violation of boundaries. And so much what we need to do is help the person have boundaries. And a helper is someone who refers to professional help as also to own what you can help with and to refer out. And that's really important. And that goes back to the Rolodex, like who can you call upon if you need help with this? So I'm talking a lot. So Michelle, you want to pipe in, or I'm open for questions right now, but these are one of the things I think we should think about is how do we, what is our stance? Who are we in this? And what we want to be is a helper. We want to be someone of support. Go ahead.
I think also, like, when you're in this situation and trying to help a friend, whatever negative situation they're in, you're kind of like, I want to do everything. And like, especially if you are like me and in the helping field, like Shana, you really just like want to help, do everything possible you can. And it's important to also recognize yourself, right? Like, is this healthy for me? Could this ruin my relationship with this person? Could this ruin like my job? I don't know, like, could this ruin anything in my life as well? So you have to kind of recognize that we have to be helpful and supportive in the best way possible. And if anyone wants to add anything, more than happy to hear.
Yeah, great time to speak up.
This discussion reminds me of problem solving versus listening and support.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Like moving away from being problem solving, and some problem, it's not our problems to solve per se. We're there to be, how do we be someone who helps that other person come to wherever their resolution is? And what we know about life is that things are not linear, right? So it's not going to be A to B to C. Often it's, A to Z to Y to K, and then people have their own journey, and we don't really know what the end is supposed to be, but what can support the person during the way. So some of the ideas that we think about being supportive, chat, I don't want to ignore it. I'd rather, private message, sorry about that. I'm always
Shana, there's a few questions coming into me that.
Okay, go for it. I'd rather go for it.
How do you deal with these kinds of issues in a dating situation, i.e. helping a friend navigate and pick up on certain tendencies when they don't know the person so well?
Great.
Let's answer that and then we'll continue the rest of the questions.
Okay, so if you're concerned about a friend, so we'll talk about this a little bit.
Actually, Shana, this goes hand in hand with the next question I got. How do you handle being supportive to someone who's not ready for help? How do you deal with watching your friend go through that while being supportive?
Okay, so something I often say to people, and there's no perfect answer, is that when your friend or your family member, and I'd say 30 to 40% of our calls, and some of my staff might be, are from friends and family members. It doesn't have to be from the survivor victim themselves. It's often other people who are looking to be supportive. They just don't know how, is to be that person who's present for that person, and to be that person who's not going to be judgmental to that person, because what you don't want to do is if you side against the person who's abusive, the person who's hurting, then that person often feels that they have to then align themselves with their abuser, right? You don't want to put them into this place where I have to choose between them. So you want to be in a place where they don't have to choose between being your friend or being your sister or being, your roommate and being in a relationship with this other person. So that's really important. Now, one thing I often will tell people is that during the time the person's in that relationship, or during the time that person's in the crisis, it's not going to be a mutually beneficial relationship. And it's important to kind of let that go. Okay. like it's going to be a time in your relationship that you'll probably be in a giving mode a bit more, and a time in your relationship where you can't expect the person to give back. And it is so powerful for you to be able to be someone who remains present and not judgmental. I could say that many of the people I've treated over the years, and I've had the privilege to go through this journey with, they'll talk about that one or two people who just didn't give up on them. And that might be that phone call or that voicemail or using I statements like, I was just concerned about what I saw, or is everything okay? And if you see something that's truly not safe, you can call it out without saying a judgmental. You're not saying he is a terrible person or she is really a jerk, or how do you let, like those are different. How do you let her talk to you that way? And we're going to go forward. I'm going to show you some statements. So it's visual. I'm a visual learner. But you could say things are you okay? I know this must be uncomfortable, but I noticed this thing going on. Are things okay? I just want to check in. You know, things that you share with me, it's going to stay with me, right? Being real about that. And that really does mean not going to talk to everybody else in the world, right?
I think that there's, Shana, I think that there's also like within reason, you know, you and I are both mandated reporters, and as are many other people on this call. So there has to be a form of confidentiality in terms of your relationship. But if you do feel like your friend is in a harmful situation, then there is reason enough.
In New York, there's no mandated reporting for adults. That's not.
In New Jersey, there is.
Right. So it's different, though. I don't have a lot of experience with that actually happening, but it is not. But if you're noticing red flags, you're noticing that there's a possessiveness, there's isolation, you're noticing things in something. It's okay to say something in a way that is warm and not judgmental, and not making that person like respond. Like I want to, you have to really use tones that are embracing to someone else. And the other part is not to expect a resolution right then, right? So to just be that person that could be present and to really listen. And then the next thing, and I often talk about this, right, about this is during Hanukkah, we called it becoming the shamish. Like you could illuminate things for people, and you could create awareness around things. And even having lectures or webinars like this, where it's out there, right? It's out there, is that helping that person get to someone that could do more of the nitty gritty with them. And you just remain that support. You don't have to take it all over. Is that helpful? I mean, I could go, is that
I think it makes sense.
What we're looking for?
I think it makes sense. You have to kind of act in a caring and kind way, in a sensitive way. You can be concerned without overly overstepping it.
I mean, I think, so, I mean, I want to go back for a little bit. So I have some, like, my pointers are, really trying to believe them. And this is true even for the social workers who do not work for ACS. We are not making, if you're in that position, it's different. But if someone comes into your therapy room, I believe them. It's not about me to be the judge and jury. It's for me I'm believing them. I'm going to listen to their experience from their perspective. That is what my role is. And as your friend, that's your role. It's very, very hard. I'll tell you that as a community member, as a person in my life, if I know both people, it's certainly it's a hard part about being an adult is, you don't want to start taking sides, but, the side is always around safety, and the side is always believing someone. And, you don't have to get involved in the gossip around it, and to just say, I'm here to be supportive. I want to respect your boundaries, but is there something I can do for you now? And, it could be as simple as, the meal, or, do you need some help arranging something? Or do you have a doctor that would be helpful to you in this? Do you want me to make a few phone calls to figure that out? But really not imposing your agenda around, like, what you need to do right now is break up with this guy. You need to break up with this guy. I'll tell you, I haven't seen that work.
Well, Shana,
so
what do you do in terms of, like, I mean, would you, if you know your friends in a abusive relationship, and you know that Shalom Task Force number, or OHEL's number, Met Council's number, right? Would you give that number to your friend, like, kind of like say, like, whenever you're ready, this is, I think it would.
So you have to figure out your relationship with your friend, right? And Rebecca wrote here, and it's important to remember you want to put risks to yourself, and you have to just kind of think that out. And that's where it's important to call. Like, if you think you're going to put yourself at risk, call us. We'll talk to you about it. We'll talk about how to do this. But I mean, in the same way you would say to a friend who is going through some kind of medical crisis, I've heard of this physician who might be helpful to you in an appropriate way, respecting boundaries, not imposing on someone. You could say, the other thing you could say is, oh, I went to this really interesting discussion the other day, brought by the Shenk Shul about this. And, there's some really great resources. And that's why I think community is so important, because once we destigmatize just talking about things, right? So when we go back to Shul, and we're back somewhat, is having signage. And in the mikvah, there should be signage, right? It shouldn't be a mystery of where to go if you need help, right? We need it to be obvious to people where they could go. And if the more we talk about it, right, it makes it more possible to people to come out. It was interesting this past week. We've seen a bit of a surge in our calls, and we're trying to figure out like what that is. We haven't done more ads. We haven't done anything particular. And unfortunately, there was this terrible tragedy in Israel. I don't know if you saw, there was a woman that was killed by her husband. And I saw immediately on Facebook, someone posted about it, someone of some sort, the Layers Project, who I think gets a lot of traction. And the immediate thing afterwards was a social worker that I know who wrote in there, if anybody's going through this, Shalom Task Force is available. Now, I do not know if that's the reason we're getting our surge in calls, but in many ways, I think those are the ways that we get people know that there's somewhere to go, right? You read something terrible, it triggers something, or you're struggling through something. And it's not only around this issue. I think other ways we struggle, and then we see a resource that feels trusted, a resource that's confidential, a resource that understands our culture. And it's important that we put it out there. So we're working on some new mikvah signage. We try to make sure that people just see us. It's always interesting. We got a call. I talked to a caller probably 2 years ago who I asked her how she came to us. And she said that she saw an ad of ours in the newspaper like 4 years earlier, cut it out and folded it and put it into like a small pocket in her wallet. She always knew it was there. And she was finally at a place that she was able to call. She felt safe enough to call. She wanted to discuss it, but it was like just seeing something, knowing that it was available. So there are ways to do that. You have to know your relationship with the person. You don't want to put yourself at risk. That's certainly an important point. But you want to be able to say things in a way that is embracing and warm and non-judgmental. So you don't want to say things, how can you let him, it is wrong to say, how do you let him talk to you that way? Or like, those are kind of things you don't want to say. You can say, I'm concerned about you, but you're going to do this in a way that's private. You're not going to do it with other people knowing you're doing it. It's not a long, you're not bringing a whole committee of people together to do this. And you do it in a way that's respectful of boundaries.
Also, how can I help? Sometimes they're not necessarily thinking of like offering, saying like, I need you to go pick up my kids from school and go pack up my house because I'm on my way out to a different state, right? But they might not think to ask you because they're so on overload. So also asking, how can I help? Or what can I do to help you?
What can I do? And sometimes you give examples. You could say, I mean, and this is just not only about domestic violence, but but in general, like, and I think some of this, I don't know, maybe, COVID, I'm being like romanticizing it because I'm not in a crisis this moment about it, though at times, I have been, but, part of it is like COVID reminds us that we're all very vulnerable. And I think that's one thing that we're really learning is that it's okay not to be okay, right? So let's take TV out of this. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay to be stressed. It's okay to have anxiety. It's okay to have relationship issues. Like that's real, right? Like those of us in healthy relationships sometimes are just healthy enough. And it's okay to feel stressed. And then what do we do with that? So, I was joking with one of my friends about like, I'll complain. Don't tell me, my husband's not listening tonight. And, but like, she's my one friend I feel safe calling saying, oh my goodness. And why does she feel safe? Because she doesn't bring it up over and over. She might, if it's something that really bothers me, she might check in 2 days later saying, how's everything going? And I know she still likes my husband. She's not holding it against him. I just had a hard time. And I think that's important, right? But you have to find those people. And when I started by saying it's like such a weird place where the sanctity of marriage is so important and it's a value of ours. It's not only a value in the Jewish community. Research and literature talks about it being a value and how in some way marriage and relationships, I don't want to talk about marriage, I want to be inclusive because it's also relationships are in some way very lonely because they're exclusive by definition, right? So you're excluding others, but how do we be those people to each other that can support each other through normal ups and downs, right? And nobody talks about there are normal ups and downs in relationships. And how do we be that person how do we find those people in our lives? And, I feel very blessed that, I hope I'm that to some of my friends. And I I feel blessed that I have some in my life like that, but it is important to recognize that. And I think that in some way, the romantic side of COVID, romantic is kind of the wrong word. The positive side of COVID is that it's all real, right? We've all gone through some really weird stuff in the last, if we're honest, some really weird stuff in the last 11 months. And, you know, prayers that's over soon, but like, let's just be real about it. So like the domestic violence is certainly on a continuum on the end, but let's just, if we dial back, how do we support one another? How do we just be real? How do we respect the fact that you go through a hard day in a relationship and still be in a loving relationship, right? And feel safe enough to share that with someone else. And that's true with other struggles in our lives, right? When children are going through stuff, when things are just not perfect. And that's just, you know, I think we all know that that's really true. I don't know if is there any other questions you want to address, or do you want me to go back to some of our framework? Because I don't.
So someone had actually just asked, how do you help someone who gets into abusive relationships again and again get into, like, how do you help them get into the healthy relationship? And I think a big part of that is counseling. And and if money is an issue, there are many free resources. I mean, they're grant-based, but Shalom Task Force is one of them. OHEL has programs. I'm only thinking about the tri-state area because that's where I'm located, but there are many programs that are accessible to these people. And I think therapy is like one of the biggest pros in working on it, because you can't work. I firmly believe that you can't work on your trauma unless you firmly work on your trauma and focus on that. So, I mean, I agree completely. I mean, one of the statements, a phrase I once heard that really resonated with me, it's either repeat or repair. And I am the farthest from a fatalistic person. I actually find it very offensive when other professionals will talk about domestic violence and talk about that, you know, the children who witness it will either become an abuser or be abused. I think that is fatalistic. It triggers me both as a social worker and as a Jew. I think it's an unfair and it's a terrible statement, because it's not the truth. We all know people who have grown up in very, very challenging families who are wonderful spouses and partners, or are in great relationships. And we all know people who grew up in lovely families that there is no evidence of any real great big T trauma, and they're terrible partners. So, you know, I really find it offensive. Like, and I've sat in so many sessions with women who their biggest fear is that the fact that they're in this situation, that they're going to make their daughters be abused. This is a typical, my daughters are all going to grow up to marry terrible men like I did. And my children are all going to be horrible men, horrible husbands. And that is just, I find that so terribly offensive. But there really is this idea of, like, you know, repair or repeat, that like many ways that's, you know, there's a template of trauma, and we all deserve to heal. And if we give ourselves the time to do that. So when I work with families, you know, I'll talk about that. Like, you know, it's not fatalistic, but we all have to get the right help, right? So it's no different than any health issue as well, right? You know, if you have a propensity in your family for diabetes, well, let's get you the help you need so you don't become, you don't suffer from diabetes, right? If you have, you know, if your family has certain genes for things, let's make sure we get the right intervention. And so it really works that way. And I maybe that's my nugget. I hope people walk away that I think it's really important not to fall into a trap to believe that it's always going to be that way. And if it happens to be someone who is some people, I don't know the reason. I don't know the reason. People have their ideas. I don't want to claim that I understand why some people are in multiple abusive relationships. I don't know. I don't feel like I'm all knowing, but that person certainly deserves to get some healing and the support they need. And I don't have to know the reason. And take a pause, perhaps take a pause on those types of relationships for a little while, and get help. And there are programs both that take insurance that are free, or may be on sliding scale, or make an arrangement, because certainly that person deserves to get the healing they need. And they have every opportunity and every hope to be able to be in a good partnership, and to not feel that they're destined not to. So there's my nugget. I hope people walk away with feeling optimistic. It's not, doesn't have to be intergenerational. So were there any other questions before we kind of close out together? So what are some supportive statements on what else can we say? How else can we?
I wrote some other notes and I didn't get to them because I'm having so much fun talking with you. But, one thing I wanted to reflect on for a minute was just, I started with saying how Washington Heights was like where I grew up as an adult in many ways. And some of the positive things I liked about Washington Heights have really informed my idea of community. And one thing I really loved about Washington Heights, and I know still exists, is the inclusivity. And how important that is, that it doesn't matter if you're single, married, a parent, not yet a parent, not wanting to become a parent, whatever your life station is that you're welcome in the community. And I found that to be a very comforting and very wonderful experience when I was living there. But as someone in the field of domestic violence, I have to say that is so incredibly important, because one thing that we often hear from people when they're in the relationship is they can't conceive of themselves being divorced or being separated, because they don't feel like, they're not only losing their relationship, they're losing their sense of community. And the more that we do this, and I know that you do this in Washington Heights, I can't say it happens in every Jewish community, but the more that we're able to, and when you go off to other communities, if you are going to go off to other communities, I'm not making you, is to always make that a priority, really, is to create community where there's thought put into how we talk about things, and I hope this doesn't come across, but it's too much, but the idea of like father-son learning on Saturday night is really excluding to single mothers, right? It should be parent-child. When we price things out and couples get some kind of discount, what is that like for someone who's no longer or is not in a couple, right? And to really think about how are those little messages that we have, support people. It's really part of support, because we think about and what does that look like? Because if you're sitting in a session with someone who's contemplating leaving a relationship, there are so many factors. But let me tell you, for the Jewish women we work with, a big factor is community. Like, what will it look like for me? How can I possibly leave this relationship? How will my sons go to Shul? Excuse me? Who will sit with them? Because I don't have to explain to you, there's mechitza. When I do this training I do trainings for other communities. They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, like, at a certain age, how do you deal with that? And to create communities where we think about every kind of permutation of community member. I know it's a big task. I'm very involved in my young Israel where I live, and I'm on the events committee, and I'm like the annoying person who is always kind of saying, well, have we thought about the single parents and how that might affect them? And they're like, oh, okay, Shana, but I feel like I have to be the voice, because I've journeyed through this with so many people, where like, how do we do that? And, maybe that's another nugget for tonight, is that when we all go out there in the world, and wherever our role is, to think about people who might be in a different situation, and how do we make sure there's inclusivity? And I see that as a protective factor. I do. I see it as, if you can envision yourself. I remember sitting with a woman who was almost killed by her husband. It was a pretty extreme physical abuse case in the Orthodox community. And she looked at me and she said, I know I need him out of the home. I know I need to involve criminal justice. I know I need to get police involved. I realize I'm in grave danger. But she goes, who is going to say Kiddush for my children? Okay. And I looked at her, and I lived on my own before I was married, and I said Kiddush, and I looked at her, and I said, well, I'm not your rabbi, and in no way is this my role, but I'm pretty sure you're allowed to say Kiddush for your children. And she goes, well, I don't understand. I said, I know that, and she was a woman who got married young out of her parents' home. And I said, I'm fairly positive we could talk to a rabbi together if that's what you need, but you're allowed to say Kiddush for your children. And her children, the sons are not yet bar mitzvah. I mean, there's all that stuff that people love to get into. And the concept to her that she would be able to have a Shabbos without having this figure, even though this figure was literally a fatal, a terribly, terribly dangerous person. And so she eventually I did support her through calling police and a separation. And there were, I think, 5 children in the home. And I remember, the Thursday session before the first Shabbos home, talking to her again about what will Shabbos look like. Very practical. This is not psychoanalysis here, right? Very practical. Like, what will Shabbos look like without a father in the home? And in many ways, it was much more peaceful, right? And she would report that later. It's actually really nice. And they could come with their own traditions. And she said Kiddush, and she learned to say Kiddush, and she learned to say Challah, and they created Shabbos for their home. But when he started getting, every other Shabbos, when custody was figured out, and it does, even parents, both parents, if it's safe, should have access to the children, if it's safe. She would say Kiddush when they were with her, but still, and I don't know if it's to this day, because I haven't spoken to her in a few years about this. She would never say Kiddush for herself. She could do it for her kids, but there was such a feeling that like it was so foreign to her. And we have to think of ways, and now Kiddush is not actually community, but in some way it's a message of community, right? How can we think of ways that people could still conceive themselves as being part of our community with whatever their lives bring them? And I'm not only talking about domestic violence, I'm talking about other situations. So it's just something to think about as we think about. So we go back to the supportive statements. I think we touched on a bit. I could bring something up, but like, how do we? And so becoming a supportive person, and I know that you do this in Washington Heights, is creating community in which people feel that they could be whoever they are, or wherever stage they're at, and how important that is. Because we need to embrace each other in all the tough times, and be real that we all go through some tough times. On a very, I think very practical, I'll bring up a slide about what supportive statements are, if that's what people are looking for. We could also, I believe, and I can, some of my staff is on, I think we even have some things we could send out to the whole group. Is that true? Someone who's on my
You
staff.
guys, or if Jeffrey or Rebecca, whoever, if you guys could just email that to me and I will.
I'm pretty sure we have something. If not, we could. But like, saying things like this sounds like a difficult experience. We're not asking you to be therapists. Sometimes people go, well, I'm not a therapist. Okay, this is not what therapy looks like. But this is not your fault. So if someone discloses to you to literally say, I believe you. That's really powerful. I believe you. This is not your fault. No one deserves to be hurt in that way. Are there any things I could do to help you feel safe right now? Now, obviously you can't put yourself at risk, but is there anything I can make you feel safe right now? I know, this must be uncomfortable. If you want to talk about this again, you could talk to me. It's not a one and done, but I'm also not going to push you for details, so respecting boundaries. But you want to just think about ways, and I think if everybody would take a few moments themselves, think about things that they wanted support, you could cater those to any situation. You don't want someone to tell you what to do, unless you're saying to someone, I need help figuring out where to go for a therapist. Then maybe the support then is saying, okay, I'm going to make some calls for you. If it's too hard for you to call Shalom task force, I'll call for you. Okay, that's a very practical ask. That's a different thing than saying, here's a list of therapists. You need to call them tomorrow and you need to tell me when you made an appointment. If you have the capacity to help someone, I'm not saying financially long-term, but if it is a situation of like, a person having to run, if you have the capacity to help someone, if it doesn't put you at risk, it's certainly something to think about. Don't do that without talking to someone who could really help guide you through that. But certainly I know people who've done that. And I'm trying to think what else is possible. I liked when you said texts are helpful. And just making sure, I think that we go back to the original thing I said right now. When we want to create supportive community, we want to help. We want to communicate to people in different ways, that we care, we want to be helpful, and that the person is not alone for whatever they're going through. So that's what we're doing here together. I think I'm going to end with that and open up for any other questions. I always have to do my little Shalom task force thing. I'm sure many of you know what it is. Look us up online. We have a website, but we have a confidential hotline chat line, which is open tonight until 10. And again, tomorrow, the number was in the chat. We have a legal services program that actually represents survivors through both consultation, through divorce, through Beit-Din, gets, based here in New York. We have educational awareness workshops, as you are experiencing tonight. We do it. We are middle of Purple Week. We have this incredible new program. I got to talk to the teens last night, of teen fellows that have gone through an 8-week program, and now they're in their schools, 12 schools, 6 different states of day schools. So something like 3,500 students, teens in our Jewish community, talking about domestic violence this week. So hopefully you'll see it all over social media. It's very exciting. And then we have a program called Shalom Workshop, which is really a great program. It's the only program that has a small fee. Everything else is absolutely free. And it's a program, it's not therapy. It is not therapy. It is a program based out of this empirical model called PrEP, which is really about relationship skills. And couples, married, unmarried couples, could reach out and work with one of our trainers. They're trained in a very particular model to talk about how to really have relationship, how to have how to talk, communicate, how to have a good fight, how to talk about finances. It's a really wonderful program. It was created to work with engaged and early married couples, but we see people, last year or a year and a half ago, probably before COVID, so I lost track of time, probably 18 months ago, one of our trainers met with a couple that was been together for 25 years, and they wrote us a letter about how that they're in a honeymoon phase. They really learned how to be better married together through this workshop. So it's available to people. It's also on our website. And I just want to leave this up here for now, if there's any more questions, just so you have the information again. We have we have phone, text, chat, and WhatsApp available. So, and that is our number. And I always mess it up, so it has to be up here. 888-883-2323. 888-883-2323. It's also on our website. So, okay. So is there any more questions?
So somebody actually just asked, I thought Beit Din doesn't allow legal representation.
Matters what Beit Din you're in. I'm not a lawyer here. The Beit Din of America, if you want to bring someone in, they have to be a lawyer. They can't be a tow-in. They have to be a lawyer that's actually admitted to the bar. That's how they hold people accountable. Other Batei Din, and this is a discussion, if it's of interest, we could get someone to talk about Beit Din for much more thoroughly than I can ever do, but other Batei Din often let a tow-in in, which is kind of an advocate. Some of them may be lawyers, some are not, but we will help someone through the process. So even if you don't go in with a lawyer, no one should ever sign anything. Am I being recorded? Do not sign anything you don't understand. Beit Din is an arbitration system. It's arbitration. It goes into court. It can be withheld. It stands up in court. So our lawyers will help people review anything that goes through Beit Din as well. So yeah. Any other specific questions?
Somebody did mention that just trust that the person knows what's the safest choice for themselves in that moment. Like if they're not ready to get up and go and escape, then you can't force them to. I mean, I've had to help somebody literally figure out how she was going to move. And there was some pushback, but she eventually did it. So I think that says a lot about the type of person. And somebody also said that stay away from at least statements. At least you didn't have any kids with him. At least, like.
Thank you for saying that, Loris. Don't try.
They're not helpful. They're not helpful.
Don't measure other people's pain and challenge. We don't know. We don't know. You know. Yeah. Try to take the most non-judgmental stance you could do. So, any other last? So again, Shalom Task Force is available. Put in your Rolodex. It's not only here for people. I think one of the misunderstandings of Shalom Task Force and our role in the community, it's not only here for people who are survivor victims themselves who are in crisis. We much prefer. We love getting the phone calls from people who are in a relationship and they have an uh-oh feeling and they want to just discuss it. We much prefer that. We are here to help people help other people. So don't ever hesitate to reach out in any way that's most comfortable to you. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. So good to be back on Washington Heights.
I did want to just say that central to being a supportive community is awareness around all types of issues, taboos, stigma. And I know that there was a time when Shenk was doing this. Now that we are virtual, it's a little easier. I would love to continue this conversation or bring any other workshop that may be beneficial to the community. Feel free to reach out. I can be reached at shenkcommunity@gmail.com or Michelle Siegel. I am easily accessible, and there is no next one on healthy relationships. And how can we review the recorded session? I will be emailing it out once I get the full recording and it is placed on YouTube. And I really just, on behalf of the Shenk Shul, I really just want, and the Washington Heights community, I wanted to thank Shalom Task Force, and I wanted to thank Shana for this wonderful opportunity to speak alongside one of my greatest mentors. And this conversation isn't over. We're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, this was fantastic. Michelle, this is really wonderful to be here. I love the engagement. This is fantastic. And please feel free to reach out if you ever need anything from us. That's what we're here for. So thank you. Stay safe, stay warm. We're going.
Thank you. You guys rock.
Thank you. Good to
I
see
knew them
you.
when. I knew them when. They're so great.
You knew me a long time ago when I was
just starting to come up.
It's good. It's all good. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great. Very informative.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you all. Eitan, can we stop the recording?